14th century was one of the hardest times in human history. Within just a few decades, the world witnessed brutal wars, deadly plagues, and the collapse of entire societies. Among these tragedies, there was one that many have forgotten: the Great Famine of 1315. It was a disaster so massive that it nearly pushed Europe to the edge of extinction. It all started with a sudden and unexpected shift in the climate. For hundreds of years, warm summers and steady harvests allowed Europe's population to grow rapidly. But in the year 1315, something changed. The skies darkened, heavy clouds moved in, and the rain simply did not stop. Even in the middle of summer, the air turned cold and damp. Crops failed to grow. Livestock could not survive. Food prices rose overnight. Hunger arrived with fury, and desperation spread fast. People began stealing, fighting over crumbs, and committing acts once thought impossible. What started as one bad year became an ongoing nightmare that stretched over 7 years and forever changed European history. But how could a shift in the weather bring an entire continent to its knees? How could so many starve in a land that had once flourished? And the most chilling question of all: how far would people go just to stay alive? To understand the fall, we must first look at the rise. Before the famine, Europe was enjoying a time of prosperity. During the 11th and 12th centuries, the climate was ideal for agriculture. Summers where warm rain came in just the right amount, and farmers reaped abundant harvests. A single seed could return as many as 7. This meant food was plentiful and people thrived. Populations reached levels never seen before. But this balance would not last. In 1315, everything shifted. The very climate that had once been the farmers' best ally became their worst enemy. Cold, heavy rains arrived during summer months, soaking the fields of northern Europe. Weeks passed without sunlight. Instead of drying and growing, farmland turned into thick swamps. Grains like wheat, barley, and rye couldn't survive. Crops died before they could even sprout. For a population that depended almost entirely on agriculture, it was the beginning of catastrophe. As harvests failed across the continent, hunger began to spread. Food prices rose sharply. What was once affordable to everyone suddenly became a luxury only the rich could buy. The nobility, seeing what was coming, began hoarding supplies. They bought up large amounts of grain and salted meats, leaving common people with nothing. The poor were left to suffer, and the worst was still ahead. The winter that followed 1315 would be one of the most brutal in centuries. With no food stored, Europe faced a disaster without any safety net. As the cold arrived, markets emptied. Farm animals died. People weakened quickly. Families went into the forests, searching for anything edible: roots, wild plants, even tree bark, to try and ease the pain in their stomachs. But winter brought another problem. The salt supply ran out. Back then, salt wasn't just a seasoning. It was the only way to preserve food. Without it, meat and fish spoiled quickly, and communities had no way to keep what little food they had. Hunger began to tear families apart. In some households, the elderly were seen as too weak to save, so they were left behind in the woods in hopes that the rest of the family could live longer. Parents sold their children as servants to wealthy families, praying they would at least be fed. Society began to fall apart. Morality collapsed. In cities, crime surged. Theft became constant. Executions happened every day. People raided their neighbors' homes, hunting for hidden supplies. Anyone with a stash of food became a target. And then humanity crossed a line it had never crossed before. Cannibalism was no longer just a story whispered in fear. It became real. As the famine stretched on, desperation deepened. The winter of 1316 was even worse. The rains returned, ruining any hope for a new harvest. Even the little wheat that managed to sprout was destroyed by storms. In many villages, people were barely clinging to life. Faces were thin and pale, bodies reduced to skin and bone. And as people grew weaker, disease moved in. Pneumonia, tuberculosis, and dysentery spread quickly. Hunger didn't just kill through starvation, it broke the body down until disease finished the job. With all rules broken, cannibalism became a grim reality. There are reports of people digging up freshly buried corpses. Others waited by roadsides to ambush travelers, not for money, but for their flesh. In the most horrific cases, people killed their own family members, choosing the weakest to sacrifice so the others could survive a little longer. Chronicles from the time describe terrifying scenes. In some places, children were left in the forest because they could no longer be fed. Other stories tell of mothers who, driven mad by hunger, ate their own children. Many of the dark folk tales we know today, like the witch who eats children or the abandoned siblings in the woods, may have been born from the horrors of this period. Even the rich were not untouched. Nobles and merchants hid behind walls and guards, but the famine reached everyone. With trade collapsing, merchants had nothing to sell. Even the wealthiest households began to feel the strain. Food ran low at their tables, and fear crept into every corner of society. Finally, in 1317, after 2 years of relentless rain and freezing cold, the skies began to clear. The sun returned, the land slowly started to dry, but for thousands, it was already too late. Recovery would not come easily. The greatest problem was that there were no seeds left to plant. During the famine, all food stores had been eaten. There was nothing saved for future harvests. So even as the climate improved, there was no way to restart the cycle of growth. The famine's damage lingered. Farm animals had vanished. Many had been eaten in the worst times, and the rest died from illness or starvation. With no livestock, there was no milk, no eggs, no meat. Fields lay empty. People were too weak to work. Years of malnutrition had left them fragile and sick. Diseases continued to kill, wiping out entire villages. Though the famine had ended, the suffering did not. Cities and rural communities struggled to come back. The nobility, once powerful, found that many of their workers had died. There were fewer farmers, fewer artisans, and fewer soldiers. Whole systems had broken down. Historians estimate that between 10 and 25% of Northern Europe's population perished during the famine. It was one of the greatest disasters of the Middle Ages, matched only by what would come next. Because the Great Famine was not the end. It was the warning. A weakened population, a broken economy, and crumbling trust in leadership left Europe open to an even darker nightmare. Only a few years later, the Black Death arrived, and it would be far worse. The famine showed that the continent was fragile. The plague would prove just how easily it could fall apart. The Great Famine of 1315 was more than just a story of hunger. It was a turning point in European history, a moment when everything that once seemed strong was revealed to be vulnerable. Millions died. Terrible acts were committed. And when the sun finally returned, the world it shone upon was not the same. The famine had ended, but the real nightmare had only just begun.